The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is truly an interesting time, which takes me back to the alleged Chinese curse that may you live in interesting times. Well, we're living in interesting times. Growing up, hearing the term pot calling the kettle black, it's a colloquialism, but another term, and I brought this up years ago here on the House floor about gaslighting. We certainly seem to be experiencing some of that these days and have for some time. But to have the Secretary of Homeland Security, seems to be an intelligent person, come and testify under oath with a straight face that the border is secure and not be satisfied with that, but refer to the Trump administration as having dismantled the immigration system, the ability to secure the border, when exactly the opposite is what was occurring. And exactly the opposite is what is occurring now. It's not secured. All you have to do is go look. I mean, it's incredible, but it is said so often, including by people on the Committee of Oversight for Border Patrol, the Judiciary Committee. And having spent so much time down on the border, I like to be there late at night when there's an awful lot of movement normally across the border illegally. But I experienced under the most closed administration, the least forthcoming administration since I've been in Congress, since January of 2005. In fact, they zoomed up Border Patrol cars to prevent me from getting to the border to see how bad it was. I was able to go around one night, get back to the border through the local park down south of McAllen, but that was no thanks to the Border Patrol that in the past, most of them knew that I was their friend and asserted on their behalf because they were not being treated fairly, properly, especially during the Obama administration. But it is important for any member of Congress to be able to get to the border unimpeded. And now Secretary Mayorkas says he looked into it and couldn't find anyone who had ever directed that a member of Congress, me in particular, was not to be allowed to get to the border. So I'll look forward to using his testimony under oath and seeing who now will try to prevent me from getting to the border. Oh yeah, they'll let you go as long as you give them time to set up a dog and pony show and have time to restrict the area that they're going to allow you to see. But that's not the way you do oversight. When I was a judge, I would just show up at a prison, jail, halfway house, different places. If I was going to send somebody to a place, I wanted to be able to see how they were being treated without warning. And I still think that's a good idea. And of course, we know the Washington, D.C. jail out east of town, where so many January 6 defendants were being held, they wouldn't let us in. not to visit, not for any reason. It really has been astounding. Marjorie Greene and I were finally allowed to get in there. Marjorie Taylor Greene and I were, and we hope to do that again soon because we're hearing more stories of abuse. I got a letter response from U.S. Marshal, whom I'd asked to go do a health and safety visit regarding Ryan Nichols. And as I understand the letter, they called over and got information from people who had deceived some of us before, and the U.S. Marshal seemed quite satisfied with that without bothering to see for himself. Rather unfortunate because the U.S. Marshal did an inspection last September, October, I believe it was October, and found that hundreds of the inmates were not being properly treated and needed to be transferred out. So hopefully the U.S. Marshal will get back to doing the job of a U.S. Marshal. The law, the Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court for a couple of centuries, has made clear you're not allowed to punish people in pretrial confinement. But just as the FISA court has shown no pride in and no protection of their court and authority, they have demonstrated that they don't mind being lied to by lawyers. They don't mind having fraud upon the court because it's a secret star chamber. And so I had hoped that when FISA judges found out they'd been manipulated and lied to, that they would have enough integrity that they would be upset about being lied to. But apparently, because of the lack of contempt, the lack of show cause hearings as to why contempt was not appropriate, the lack of prosecution by the Department of Justice, going after people within the justice system. Apparently, I've come to the conclusion, I hoped we could save the FISA court, but apparently it does not appear that that's going to be possible. Our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has not had enough concern about lies being perpetuated, fraud being perpetuated on the FISA court, that he, as far as we know, has not done anything about that because certainly no one is punished, not even perpetuating lies in order to spy on the campaign and even the presidency after the person they were spying on and trying to prevent from winning the election won the election. So it's a very disturbing time for those of us who have spent much of our adult lives in state and federal justice system trying to see that justice was done. It's a very disturbing time. And yet, going back to the term gaslighting, we're told that we're crazy, we're making stuff up. I know with regard to the 2020 election, people continue to repeat the untruth that there was no fraud in the 2020 election when most every election has ever been did have fraud, did have improprieties. It's just a question of how much. But it's John Fund that wrote a book on election fraud, quite good some years back, has pointed out before the biggest fraud about elections is saying there's no fraud in elections. And when Congress made the inappropriate step of mandating electronic voting back after the unfortunate situation in Florida, where even though fifth graders were shown to be able to to utilize the butterfly ballots quite effectively, we had Democrat voters that were not able to figure them out. Perhaps another visit to fifth grade might have helped them before they voted, but that's why we were told we had to upend our election system in the United States and go to electronic voting. Many of us are hoping we'll get back to paper ballots because we have seen, although people were gaslighting and saying, oh, no, these machines do not connect to the internet, then we find out when there was a problem with a voting machine, they'd contact one of the that's using the internet. Yet we were gaslighted and told, even though it was going on, it wasn't going on. And just to remind people who are not familiar with the term gaslighting, I thought the 1944 movie with Ingrid Bergman is a great movie. I've watched when she wasn't at all. He was being evil. This from Medical News Today says, gaslighting is a form of psychological abuse where a person or group makes someone question their sanity, perception of reality, or memories. People experiencing gaslighting often feel confused, anxious, and unable to trust themselves. The term gaslighting derives from the 1938 play and 44 film, Gaslight, in which a husband manipulates his wife into thinking she has a mental illness by dimming their gas-fueled lights and telling her she is hallucinating. The article goes on to give different examples. It says gaslighting often develops gradually, making it difficult for a person to detect. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, techniques a person may use to gaslight someone include countering. Countering describes a person questioning someone's memories. They may say things such as, "You never remember things accurately," or, "Are you sure? You have a bad memory." Another technique is withholding. When someone withholds, they refuse to engage in a conversation. A person using this technique may pretend not to understand someone so that they do not have to respond to them. For example, they might say, "I do not know what you're talking about," or "You're just trying to confuse me." But I would submit that withholding can include when being asked for information, evidence, that being withheld, and in return being told, "No, there's nothing there." I mean, it comes to mind back when Jeff Sessions was the Attorney General. Some of us had concerns about a matter that needed to be investigated, and we knew that there was a person of integrity who had a notebook full of documentation, many of which documents could quite easily constitute an offense under federal law. And that was pointed out that, gee, this needs to be investigated. This person needs to be talked to. And eventually, this incredibly competent person was contacted by an FBI agent after the Secretary of Department of Justice asked them to take a look. The FBI contacted her and told her to come for a visit, and under no circumstances was she to bring her notebook that contained valuable evidence of apparent wrongdoing. And when she arrived, she was grilled for 2 hours. She did as she was instructed by the FBI, didn't bring her notebook of documents. And then when Secretary Sessions asked about the matter, he was told, yeah, we looked into it, we talked to her, she didn't have anything. Well, that's a form of gaslighting. You direct a witness not to bring the documentation she has, and then tell your boss, yeah, we talked to her, she didn't have anything. Well, you told her not to bring the evidence. So these kind of things, unfortunately, still go on, and I can't help but suspect that when Bill Barr said there was no fraud in the election, he was relying on people like Jeff Sessions did when he was lied to, because obviously Bill Barr didn't go out and do an investigation personally. He relied on people perhaps he should not have relied on. And how do we know that anybody at the FBI would lie? Well, we found out it was even done before a federal judge or federal judges. And the other shoe is yet to drop on all of that. But something's got to be done. We can't have a star chamber system where judges are lied to. And clearly, when the judges don't care, I mean, they've got lifetime appointments, that's one thing. But then when their adjudications, their hearings are in secret, they have a layer of anonymity that protects them from being judged and ridiculed for either stupidity, naivety, or just dishonesty. Whatever it is, it's not right. That's why our court system was required to be public originally. But as we see these fundamental foundational principles being removed in the last decades, recent decades, it ought to be a warning. It ought to be a red light flashing, bells going off. Danger, danger, Will Robinson. This is serious stuff, and it needs to be looked into. According to this article, trivializing is another technique. This occurs when a person belittles or disregards the other person's feelings. They may accuse them of being too sensitive or of overreacting when they have valid concerns and feelings, like, say, about an election. And like, say, some of us who in this chamber objected to electors exactly, well, almost exactly like our Democrat friends did on January 6th of 2001, January 6th of 2005, and 11 times on January 6th of 2017. So some of us felt like our Democrat friends understand there's nothing unconstitutional or criminal or illegal about coming into this chamber and objecting. Now, the difference was the Democrats in 2017, January 6, 2017, as I recall, they didn't have a senator to join the objection, which made them illegitimate. On some objections in 2021, we did have senators, some we didn't, but at least we had senators join on some. But we thought surely the Democrats, since they objected every time a Republican won since 2000, they would understand or would believe the legitimacy of raising an objection, yet they convinced so much of the American public that anybody that objected was guilty of sedition, treason, all kinds of crimes, which often is a mark. You know, I've been a prosecutor, a felony judge. A lot of times when somebody who has done some activity accuses somebody else of having criminal intent, when they do the same activity. It's evidence that they had criminal intent when they did that action. But interestingly, I'm still amazed that there are still people in this body that want to accuse those who objected, as the Democrats have, and like I say, 2017, 11 times, accuse them of criminality. That's amazing, and perhaps that lends itself to being a form of gaslighting. We're crazy, we're criminal because we did what they've done every time a Republican won in the last 20 years. Another technique is denial. Denial involves a person pretending to forget events or how they occurred. Like when somebody says, no, we never do that, we never did that. Well, you think we're crazy? It's in the record, there's video. You can go online and find the video of it occurring. There were objections by Democrats, which sure sounded to be spurious, but the meme that was going around indicated what's the difference between criminal conspiracy and truth. The answer was about 6 months. Well, that's inaccurate because it's been about 18 months and we're still discovering truth on some things that were alleged to have been just crazy form of gaslighting, crazy insurrectionist, criminal conspiracies. These people are insane that think there were any problems with the 2020 election. The movie that Dinesh D'Souza and Catherine Engelbrecht and Greg had put together, worked on, 2,000 Mules, that's just one technique of fraud that was utilized in the 2020 election. These are things that ought to cause bipartisan research and effort to try to prevent, if anybody is truly interested in having free and fair elections. Another technique, according to this psychological article, is diverting. With this technique, a person changes the focus of a discussion and questions the other person's credibility instead. For example, they might say, that is just another crazy idea you got from your crazy friends or friends. I keep hearing people making allegations against Clarence Thomas. And I was speaking at an event where John Yoo also spoke. He clerked, as I understand, for Justice Clarence Thomas. And I was quite pleased to hear him say what I believe is absolutely true for anybody that cares to do their research, that Justice Clarence Thomas is one of the most intelligent judges to ever sit on the U.S. Supreme Court. Yet he is demeaned. We had a hearing going on. A man named Mark Paoletta was testifying, and he mentioned that he believed the attacks on Justice Thomas were racist because he's a black person, an originalist regarding the Constitution, who appears to be conservative. And one of the Democrat members on the committee asked for any evidence whatsoever of any racist attacks on Clarence Thomas, and the response was, well, you just had a chairman call him an Uncle Tom. That's number one, but I've got tons more even from this hearing, and he did, but he was cut off and not allowed to give further evidence of the racism being utilized against such a brilliant justice on the Supreme Court because he happens to be black and he happens to think for himself. And I've mentioned this in our hearing because I don't think people know his background. I was greatly intrigued and found it extremely interesting reading Clarence Thomas's autobiographical book, My Grandfather's Son. He's been accused, I've heard him being accused many times of not being black by people that don't know what it is to be poor and black. Justice Thomas does. He lived with his mother, as I understood, I recall from the book, about 6 months in Atlanta. Horrendous time, but he was basically, he and his little brother, raised by their grandparents, Pinpoint, Georgia, right on the coast. And because they were on the coast, he pointed out, they had food. They could get greens that were called poke salad. I don't like them, but they could always go out and pick poke salad going wild. And because they were right there on the coast, they could get fish or different type things, whether it was mussels or clams or fish, whatever. They were able to get a lot of food. And he was so smart, so intelligent. He got a scholarship to Holy Cross and then ultimately decided he wanted to go to law school, applied to Harvard, but I think it was half a day he was at Harvard, and as he paints himself, he was an angry black radical liberal, and he felt like Harvard was too conservative, so he left and applied for Yale, and he liked Yale better because it was much more liberal, he felt like. But he began to notice that liberals seemed to look down on him, that they didn't want to talk to him about anything but sports or oppression of blacks in America. And he noticed that the 2 or 3 conservatives in the school, they were interested in his opinions on all kinds of things and would talk to him about things. And he began to notice and appreciate that. And in a discussion with one of the few conservatives, they were talking about seat belts, helmets, whether they should or shouldn't be mandatory. And he expressed the opinion that, he felt like they just ought to have a law passed that required everybody to wear a seat belt and everybody on a motorcycle to wear a helmet. And the conservative, giving a more libertarian question, said, in effect, you have seen government used to oppress blacks in America. Why in the world would you ever want to give the government any more control over your life? And that set him thinking. And eventually he began to realize, you know what? It's not a good idea to continue to give the government more and more power because it can be abused. And this is a man that thought for himself. But he also knew how intelligent he was. And it had to be a bit insulting to have people act like, gee, me, whereas he knew the truth. He was there because he was a brilliant person, and he has not gotten credit for his consistency, for his intellect, for his integrity. It's constantly being demeaned, and they try to gaslight him. It hasn't worked. Another technique is stereotyping. This says an article in American Psychological Review states that a person using gaslighting techniques may intentionally use negative stereotypes of a person's gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, nationality, or age to manipulate them. For example, they may tell a female that people will think she is irrational or crazy if she seeks help for abuse. And as an assistant DA, I saw that, and it was amazing to me. I was a bit naive, but to see a woman bruised, battered, clearly beat up, you wanted to see her husband we wanted to see him put in jail. Nobody should ever treat anybody, male, female, anybody, the way that some of these battered women got treated. And yet they would be gaslighted to the point that after the bruises and the abrasions went away, they'd come back and say, don't want to press charges. And one in particular, I said, look, this is not your choice. Under the law, we have the right to go after your husband because he clearly abused you, and it's going to keep continuing. And we asked you when you came in, do you promise you will not back off this time? You'll let us go after your husband for this kind of abuse? And she had said, absolutely, with her face all swollen, black and blue, and scraped. It was horrendous. And yet, he worked on her psychologically. She eventually comes back and says, I want to withdraw the charges. Say, we've got the pictures. We're going to go ahead and press charges this time. Well, if you do, I'm going to say that I was trying to kill him and he was just defending himself. The psychological abuse had worked, and it was just so heartbreaking to see somebody. And usually they had been gaslighted to the point they thought they deserved it. Nobody deserved that. But we're seeing these same techniques being used today. And at this time, I would like to yield to my friend, Ms. Lesko, for such time as she may utilize.
Thank you, Representative Gohmert. And as you know, I am a survivor of domestic violence. And so it's still hard for me to talk about it. And it's almost been 30 years ago since I left my abusive ex-husband. And domestic abuse and violence is very common, unfortunately. I think 1 in 4 women are abused by either a boyfriend or a husband, and it's a very, very big issue that I'm glad you're showing attention to and shining light on. At this time, very briefly, I thank you for yielding me some time, Representative Gohmert, but I want to thank our U.S. Supreme Court justices for the hard work and dedication that they have. And I want to condemn the intimidation tactics that are taking place against our U.S. Supreme Court justices. It's an absolute shame and needs to be stopped. As we await the U.S. Supreme Court's decision that may overturn Roe versus Wade, I stand with the vulnerable women and girls grappling with unplanned pregnancies and the precious infants that they carry. Pro-abortion advocates and some elected officials push vulnerable women and girls towards abortion and deem it as an empowering choice. There is no empowerment nor compassion in abortion. There is no encouragement in crushing, dismembering, poisoning babies, and sucking them out of the womb with a vacuum.
Appreciate my friend from Arizona so much. Miss her on the Judiciary Committee because of the very type of insights that we just heard from her. I'm grateful for her service, her intellect, her insights. and especially her pugnacious nature that did not cause her to back down, that caused her to stand up after being a victim herself. I was approached by a lady at a store in Longview, Texas, adjoining county to where I was a district judge, and she asked if I remembered her, and I didn't. Well, she never testified in court, but she said she was there in the courtroom when I sentenced her husband, that she and her daughter had been abused year after year, and her husband had been arrested different times, but he was such a smooth salesman that he always convinced judges to give him a slap on the wrist and probation and be on his way, and that I was the first judge in all those years to be able to see through her husband's great salesmanship and send him to prison. And there's a lot of things that aren't pleasant about being a judge or a justice, been that too, but to have somebody say, you gave my daughter and me our lives, and we're doing great, and she's doing great, and she's going to go to a great college now. Anyway, but you got to be able to see through gaslighting. You got to be able to see through lies and get to the facts. Now, we're being told about what a terrible shortage of baby formula there is in this country. And there is. You go in the stores, the shelves have a tremendous shortage. We hear different excuses, but if you had a businessman like President Trump in the White House, when he sees a shortage of something that was needed, he would find out where the problem is. He would call the people that could do something about it. Hey, we got to do something about this. And they would figure out a way to get something done about it. Find out where the holdup were, where the problem was. But instead, when there seems to be a shortage or a problem, well, any Republicans say, hey, why aren't we doing something about the baby formula? This gaslighting technique gets used. And then we find out not only is there a shortage in the store, but you just shipped truckloads of baby formula to the border, which acts as a draw to more illegal immigration, especially women with babies or parents with babies, to come across and get the baby formula that is not being allowed to go to Americans and American citizens or people that are legally here. And the thought comes of the flights. Every week we're in session, flight up here, flight back. We sit through the same presentation over and over again by the flight attendant. Sometimes they do it live. Sometimes they're just going through the motions and there's a tape playing. But they make very clear if we have a problem like the fuselage depressurizing, the oxygen mask will drop down, and adults are to put the mask on themselves before they put it on the child. And the reason is rather simple. Because if you're trying to put your child's mask on and you don't have oxygen, there's a good chance you'll pass out, and then both you and your child will die You get that on yourself, and then you will have the oxygen you need to think clearly to make sure your child or children or those dependent upon you can get what they need. When someone is determined not to provide help to Americans that you're sending all over the world, or you're sending as a lure to people to come in illegally, which we heard during our committee hearing. Yes, we do want to make these people into voters that are flooding in illegally. That was quite a revelation, although we'd suspected that for some time. But there are consequences to not taking care of the greatest, most philanthropic country in the history of the world that has done more for other people, other nations. Yes, we've had our own problems, but no one has fought racism like was fought here. The most loss of life ever in any war was in the Civil War. Over 500,000 people died over this issue of slavery. There's no country that has ever fought to end slavery, to end racism the way this country has. I thought we had made tremendous progress. And that was one of the things about the United States Army. You know, I was at the home of the infantry, and you just wanted to make sure that the person next to you was going to be helpful. You weren't concerned about their race or anything like that. You just wanted to make sure that you were going to work together, and it was quite a good microcosm, even though the 4 years I was in, it was not a pleasant time to be in the military. We were sometimes ordered not to wear a uniform off post because there were people that hated us for wearing a uniform. That was post-Vietnam. But with regard to the baby formula, if you keep drawing people into this country, now we're told we need to pay people to have abortions. You keep taking those actions, you will destroy this nation. And once this most philanthropic country in the history of the world is destroyed or converted into some dictatorial Orwellian society, all these countries that we've been able to help since particularly 1789 when the Constitution was ratified, that help is not going to be there. And having heard from people, countries, especially legislatures in parliamentarians in other countries that we consider to be free, they privately will say and have, you have got to protect America's freedom. We see you losing it. And when you lose your freedom in America, there will be no place else to go to have freedom. You're the one that has secured it for the places that have it. This is so important. So when our judiciary and when our executive Department of Justice abuses people and abuses the system and uses lies instead of truth and uses technology to spy on its citizens, we're in big trouble. And I know when I first got here in January of 2005, we Republicans were in the majority, but when it came to civil rights, we had a lot of friends on the other side of the aisle that felt the same way. And there were some on our side who wanted to protect all the power we could give to the Department of Justice. But again, there were people on both sides of the aisle that said this is a threat to our democratic republic. We can't give them this much power. But over the years, after Democrats took the majority in January of 2007 through January of 2011, and then got it back, we're not getting the kind of help we did those first 2 years with dealing with the abuses within our own ministry of truth. Because the DOJ really, using Orwellian terms from 1984, and as I've said before, what we're seeing is the only thing Orwell got wrong was the year. It wasn't 1984, it's now. And it's not called the Ministry of Truth or the Ministry of Love. The Ministry of Love, of course, in 1984, people remember, that was the entity that took people into custody, knocked down doors. They used the 1980s. And I had so much respect for the FBI agents I knew, and I'd seen numerous times. I didn't do a lot of criminal work during the 10 years that I was a civil trial lawyer, but they would contact a defendant, soon to be a defendant, say, we got an indictment, we got a warrant. You can either report to the jail at 10 a.m. tomorrow, or we'll come get you, and you'd much rather come in on your own. If they had a lawyer, they would call the lawyer, have your client come in at 9 or 10 a.m. Not now. Oh, no. Oh, no. We want the Justice Department, they want to come in and knock down your door because it's a lot more fun. They have the battering ram, and it's a lot more fun to get people in their underwear or maybe in their pajamas that are in bed because you get to scare them and it's easier to intimidate them. What happened to those days when it didn't matter whether the assistant U.S. attorney or the FBI agents voted Democrat or Republican? They were going to make sure they didn't abuse their power. I'm not seeing that kind of concern like I used to see from people in the Department of Justice. I know there's some that feel that way, but yet they're being gaslit if they try to report or be whistleblowers, and their careers are destroyed, kind of like Director Mueller destroyed the career of the FBI agent that was a whistleblower and reported the unethical and, I would say, illegal conduct by the FBI in trying to persecute during the prosecution of Ted Stevens when they abused the system and convicted an innocent man. That's the Mueller way. You promote the one that engaged in the fraud, and you reward or you punish the one who reported the fraud within the FBI. And we've just seen it grow worse and worse as Mueller's very dear friend James Comey took over. The abuses grew. And then Christopher Wray was appointed to clean up the FBI. And it appears to me his way of cleaning things up is just sweep it under the rug. And if somebody lies to the FISA court, commits a crime, whereas if it were a conservative, they would put them under the prison rather than punish. We'll just let him go get a more high-paying job somewhere else. That's not punishment. It's not deterrent. And it is doing massive damage to this country. So we have the Ministry of Truth now, called the Disinformation Board, that's been created. And this is being led and created by people who have been champions of disinformation, champions of gaslighting, who want to convince America, if you think there's a problem, if you think there's abuse in the FISA court, if you think there was any improprieties in elections, then we need to come after you and charge you with disinformation. And just like for those of us who have not read 1984 or don't remember, the Ministry of Truth, in this case now called the Disinformation Board, they were charged with rewriting history every day. And as Orwell pointed out through, I believe his name was Winston, on one day they might say, well, this government did not invent the airplane, but all of the good changes that have made it more effective, more efficient, faster, those came by our great big brother government. And then eventually you would get to the point where you would just forget all of that and say, big brother government created the airplane, has had everything to do with making it effective, and just take credit for everything good and then blame everybody else for anything bad. So that seems like where we're going. We could call it the Gaslighting Board, but it's called the Disinformation Board, and it's headed by a person who herself has been quite guilty of disinformation, and yet she's going to be in charge of coming up with disinformation for the future, apparently, and we can expect problems ahead for sure. And now, this article from May 12th, yesterday, from the New York Post, Nina Jankowicz says verified Twitter users should edit others' tweets. I mean, we're right out of 1984, going back to the days of the 50s when some songwriter wrote, if your mommy is a commie, well, you got to turn her in. This is where it appears the Disinformation Board wants to go. Yeah, kids, turn in your parents. If you find out that they've said anything privately at home that is inconsistent with the new truth that the Disinformation Board has come up with, this is dangerous stuff. It cannot be overstated. We have got to stop the Disinformation Board. The solution to misinformation is more freedom so that people that have accurate information can come out with it. But when the government puts its finger on the scales of justice, on the balance, then you can be assured you're going to get less truth and less justice, because it's not going to be fair. You know, I mentioned before I was an exchange student for a summer to the old Soviet Union, and from what I understood, you know, it was the Soviet government, it was the Communist Party. They put out all this misinformation, and they would lie about things. They would cover up. Still wonder how many cosmonauts may have died during their space program, but they never came out truthfully with what all happened. But I was with a couple of Soviet college students who I liked a great deal. They were wonderful people. And we were looking at an exhibit about some of the space program things. And you know, Gagarin was the first human ever in space. And there were some entries about Gagarin and the world hero that he was. And up to that point, I felt like, well, these are college students who would be the most likely to get upset if they were lied to. And it said something about Gagarin being killed testing a new experimental plane. And the Soviet college friend, male, said, yeah, right, well, he spoke terrific English. He said, yeah, well, we know that's not true. And I was intrigued. You know, I'd never not heard them indicate that they knew they were being lied to by the Soviet government. And the other Soviet college student said, yeah, there's no way that happened. And I said, you don't believe he was killed testing a plane as a test pilot? And they both chimed in, no, there's no way. He was the greatest hero in the history of the world, the first man in space. There is no way the Soviet government would allow him to get into a plane by himself that wasn't safe. That didn't happen. It was too important. He was too important as a hero, as someone that made us admire our government. They wouldn't let him die like that. Well, I didn't know whether he died as a test pilot or not, but I was intrigued that they believed to their core that the Soviet government lied to them. Why? Because the Soviet government constantly lied to them. They would make up lies. In fact, I remember this was 1973, found it interesting in Pravda. They were reporting some things about Watergate emerging back in the U.S., and because it really was like a disinformation board or Ministry of Truth, whichever one you want to call it, they made everything about the Soviet Union. Everything was centered on the Soviet Union. So their take on Watergate was that because Richard Nixon came to the Soviet Union, the first president ever to do so, that's why the Democrats came after him and were wanting to throw him out of office or put him in jail because he made friends with the Soviets. Well, that was their take in order to make it all about the Soviet Union. And of course, we know crimes were committed and the cover-up was the worst of it. But this is where we're headed. And it's a very dangerous time. We do not need a disinformation board. We need people being able to stand up and speak up without intimidation because they're conservative black or because they are abused or whatever. They need to be able to speak up and to bring evidence forward or at least have an investigation to get to the bottom of things without being belittled, without being gaslit, and that will do more to secure our freedom for the future. And with that, I yield back.